Thank you. Now we are outside in a field of cover crops for this Affinity Water podcast, part of the Affinity Water podcast series. Can you just introduce yourself, our panel? You are?
I'm Sean Dowman, I'm Agricultural Advisor for Affinity Water.
I'm Paul Cherry, I farm here in Weston and also one of the host farmers for the Groundswell event.
John Cherry, Paul's brother. I also farm and help run Groundswell.
Let's just talk to Paul and John first before we go inside. We're standing in a field of cover crops. 20 years ago, people wouldn't have known what cover crops were. They wouldn't have known what environmentally friendly farming is. Is that right, Paul?
I think they would have known what a cover crop was, but it tended to be something that you planted to graze rather than specifically to look after the soil and to sort of build the soil. Things have changed dramatically in the last 20 years. I mean,
John, I'm interested in this brotherly relationship. When you and Paul set out to do no-till farming, we'll explain what that is later, but did you argue about it? Did one wake up in the morning having a eureka moment and had to convert the others, or were you of like minds?
Yeah, I think, well, I was of like mind, and I just told Paul that's what was going to happen. And it was... And I think I might have waited till he went on holiday and sold the plough, that kind of thing. But it's, we sort of muddle along, yeah.
there was a key moment in our decision making, which was it was a lovely September day, which turned into one of those dramatic storms. 2 inches of rain in an hour, sort of rainstorms. We farmed sort of rolling ground. It's not steep ground. Our neighbour had ploughed a field on his side of the hill, and on our side of the hill, by chance, it was still in stubble, so it was left over from the harvest, so it still had all the roots of the stubble holding. So very similar soils, very similar topography. We went back the next day, and where he'd ploughed, there were gullies all the way down the hill, and a lot of soil had moved down the hill to the bottom of the hill. I mean, I'm talking about a lot of soil, and there was an area probably half the size of a football pitch where a lot of the topsoil had moved down the hill. It sort of shouted at us that we just can't carry on treating the soil as just something to grow crops. We've got to look after it a bit more. Because what we were seeing was the topsoil moving down the hill, but I mean, what we weren't seeing was how much was going into the river and how much is going into the rivers all the way across the planet. So, yeah, that was really, for me, why it was a very easy decision to rather go along with what John was talking about.
John and Paul Cherry of like minds, and just quickly, Sean, as I said, we're going to have a cup of tea and some chocolate biscuits before we come back here. But Affinity Water, headline sponsors for several years and next year in 2022 of the successful Groundswell event, which attracts farmers and other opinion formers from all over the world apparently now. But why does Affinity Water want to be the headline sponsor?
Well, firstly, it's a great local event in our patch, and I think it's really great to be able to support that, but it's more fundamental than that. I mean, the health of soils has a big impact on the water environment, and that link is really close, and by supporting Groundswell, in our own way, we can support the movement that is farmer-led, that's sharing knowledge about soil health, and hopefully that will kind of lead to improved soil health within our catchments, which will in turn be beneficial for our chalk streams and the groundwater aquifers.
Well, that's fine. Let's go back to the farm, Western Farm, and have our cup of tea. We'll take our spade and come back with it later. And let's not forget the dog. Come on. Well, that's the nice sound of tea and biscuits being delivered. We are looking at what is called regenerative farming. Sean, can you just tell me why Affinity Water supports regenerative farming?
Regenerative farming is all about enhancing soil health, building soil health, thinking a bit differently about our landscapes and how we farm our landscapes. Affinity Water obviously all our water comes from the environment and from catchments that are farmed. Regenerative farming offers a lot of benefits for not only farmers and the wider environment, but quite specifically for the water environment as well. Regeneratively farmed soils are much better absorbing water, reducing runoff. It's about sort of using less inputs, less chemicals on the farm, which can end up in water. So there's lots of reasons why a water company would be interested in regenerative farming, and we are. It's great to support Groundswell events and work with the farmers locally to try and see what we can do to kind of encourage this type of farming practices more in our catchments.
Well, let's go over to John and Paul, the experts in what's called regenerative farming. Our audience may have heard from them before, but you call yourself farmers. Might I just say you're innovative or pioneering farmers? John, tell me a little bit about the history of regenerative farming.
Well, it's nice to say we're pioneers, but actually farmers around the world have been experimenting with different forms of what is now called regenerative farming agriculture for some time, and we, I suppose, have been at it for a good 10 years here. Every day is a school day. I mean, we're still learning how to do it. I mean, it's really a case of watching what Mother Nature does, because she's had several 100 million years head start on us, and the more we can effectively mimic nature, the better off we are. I mean, as Sean said, it's getting the whole sort of ecosystem to function as well as possible. It makes it much cheaper to grow good crops. In every farmer's interest to do it. They have a more resilient economic and ecological system.
But people must have questioned your sanity when all those years ago you set off on what they call no-till farming, which means, you're not using the normal fertilizers, the normal farm machinery. Explain a little bit about that phrase, no-till.
Well, tillage is a sort of act of cultivating. So we eschew all cultivations, really. We stopped ploughing here, 20 years ago, Paul? Yeah. Because ploughing, it's been going on since Neolithic times, but in the last few years, with very big tractors, been able to plough deeper and faster than ever before. So you can convince yourself it's cheap and traditional way of farming, but actually it's incredibly expensive from the metal and tractor and diesel point of view. But worst of all, from our point of view, you're turning the soil upside down, and the soil is a fantastically complex ecosystem in its own right, and the top few inches is where most of the action happens. So if you come along and turn it upside down, it's a disaster from the soil creature's point of view. There's so many living creatures in a healthy soil, and they are what work it and make it effective as a water purifier or a sink for carbon or all the ecosystem benefit which we're keen on.
But now people understand, Paul, the phrase ecosystem benefits. If you roll back 20 years ago, your bank manager must have said, your families, hey, we can't do this, it's not going to be profitable, we're going to starve. I mean, people must have questioned what you are actually doing and why.
It is interesting. Of course, farmers definitely question what we're up to, because it's in farmers' DNA to sort of produce more of everything. It's always been about yield, and we've got this sort of mentality which really started after the war, where there were food queues and there were people dying of starvation in Europe. So the whole European government basically turned to farmers and said, we're going to support you to produce as much food as possible. And that has still stuck. Now, farmers love producing a lot of yield. The world population has doubled in my lifetime, and I'm 60. And food is still very, very cheap. So there's an awful lot of food out there. We don't need to produce massive amounts of food. What we've got to start thinking about is what's much more important is we look after our soils so that we can carry on producing cheap, good food for the foreseeable future, for the next few hundred years. This isn't about just sort of, we've effectively been sort of raping our soils for so long and just adding all the inputs we need. All those inputs are finite. Go back to relying on nature to build natural fertility, and the ecosystem, which John mentioned, is actually building fertility in soils, in that topsoil. But we need to let it get on with it and not disturb it, which is what a plough or a cultivator does.
And people now understand, John, that it's good for the environment, don't they? But again, roll back 20 years ago, they didn't.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, people did slightly raise an eyebrow when we started messing.
Slightly.
Well, slightly. Yeah, I mean, yes, you sort of see Land Rovers slowing down as they pass the farm, and you can see what the hell are they up to now. We got very excited about no-till farming when we started, but then it doesn't necessarily work if you carry on your old system but just stop cultivating. It works for a bit, but you have to actually feed the soil. You've got to build the soil up and build up the creatures, all the little tiny things and the bigger things that eat them, and eventually get to the worms and stuff, which are the real soil engineers, and they create all the major roads in the soil and the holes that allow the water to soak in and all the rest of it. So it's not enough just to stop cultivating. But I mean, there are effectively 5 principles of regenerative agriculture, which if you observe them, then your soil tends to get better. And not cultivating is the first one, or not disturbing the soil as little as possible is number 1 on the list. And that's physical disturbance and also chemical disturbance. We can put too much fertilizer on or too much sprays, which also has negative effects on the soil creatures.
And it also has negative effects on the river, doesn't it, Sean? And that's what Affinity Water has been doing, working with the Cherry brothers here, their farm, the Groundswell event they hold each year, which ministers now come to, but also educating farmers on the impact of those fertilisers and nitrates and how they end up in our rivers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly what happens on farm can have a big influence on the local catchment, on the local rivers. We can pick up fertilisers, pesticides can end up in the water and soil as well. And these are all things that can have an impact on the ecology of the river, but also has an impact where we're abstracting water for public water supply. Those things have to be removed, which costs energy, time, money. And so actually, by working with farmers in the catchments, trying to put some of our time and resource not just into building more treatment works and buying more chemicals to treat water, actually if we try and be part of the regenerative farming kind of movement and identify where we can support it. Ultimately, this is driven by farmers, and this is what's so inspiring about Groundswell. It's a farmer-led event, and a lot of what's happening in regenerative farming is farmer-led. And we're not going out and saying, you must do this, and in many cases, we're learning from what farmers are doing and the innovations. And it's about us identifying maybe knowledge gaps and actually pointing out to the water industry, say, hang on a minute, we could actually invest in regenerative farming, and actually that could have a real economic benefit further down the line for the water industry.
For the health of our rivers.
Exactly, the health of the rivers and groundwaters. We actually work out the economic benefits. And it's not all about money. I mean, this is about, obviously, more of a kind of societal, environmental benefits as well, but there is an economic value of doing things better in the landscape, reducing that soil runoff, which that's one of the great things that regenerative farming does. Not disturbing the soil, building soil carbon vastly reduces the risk of soil being lost into the river. See, this is an area of precious chalk streams. Having more regenerative farming in our landscapes, I can only see being a good thing for rivers.
And also, you at Affinity Water are sponsoring something called cover crops.
Yeah, cover crops is one aspect of regenerative farming. It's not a silver bullet, but I think it's a really important kind of part of a farming system that's actually missing from quite a lot of farming rotations across the country and locally. And actually, all farmers are different and they're on a different parts of a journey. Some farmers may not be interested in becoming regenerative farmers. Cover crops is a really nice way of introducing farmers who perhaps haven't considered aspects of regenerative farming to elements about building soil carbon. And
so you plant these crops in the winter, not to harvest, but simply to take the nitrates and chemicals out of the soil.
Yeah, I mean, you plant them in late summer and they're very good at capturing nitrate. Whenever a crop is harvested, there's always a bit of nitrogen left over in the soil. In the winter months, if you don't hold on to that, there's a good chance that that's going to leach. Nitrate is very leachy. When it's in the river environment, it can cause problems for ecology, and it's also something that water companies have to remove from water if levels get too high. So cover crops are really good at absorbing excess nitrate in the soil, but they do so many other good things. They build carbon. They're capturing the sun's energy at a time of year when often farmers won't have much growing on the land, certainly not the crops that they would harvest. So actually having that cover crop, you're maximising the length of the year in which you can capture the sun's energy, which is ultimately, you're capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and pumping it into the soil.
Well, shall I let you drink the rest of this tea that's been made for us with these chocolate biscuits in the tin by Paul and John? But coming back to you, Paul, cover crops, is that something that is covered at the Groundswell events that farmers take an interest in now?
Oh, yes, very much. I mean, John mentioned the 5 principles of what we're up to. Sean's covered one of them, but they also do 2 other things. One is to maintain living roots in the soil, and the other one is protecting the soil surface. So you imagine in winter a ploughed field is totally exposed to the elements, and in summer they're exposed to the heat of the sun. But if they're covered in a cover crop, and cover crops can be a metre tall and with lots of living roots in the soil, they're protecting this very vulnerable soil from sort of ravages of rain. So that's 2 other parts of cover crops which are really important. Groundswell, we're really majoring on all principles of regenerative agriculture at Groundswell, so obviously cover crops are a very important part of it. Some of our headline sponsors are cover crop seed suppliers, and so they're very interested in demonstrating the good works of cover crops. But it's not just about them selling seed. Cover crops aren't harvested, but they can be grazed, for example. They can be very nutritious for grazing animals, and also they can actually pump nitrogen into the soil. If they're a legume, for example, they will effectively buy free nitrogen out of the air and store it in the soil. So that's a major sort of bit of free fertility, which of course we like.
Is it right to say you're not preaching to farmers? Would you say you're converting them to your mindset that this event a few years ago didn't attract the numbers? It does now. It's a sellout. Government ministers, George Eustace, came and spoke. You had celebrities interviewing him. It's a big event in the farming calendar now, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is. I mean, it's a massive event. It's a worldwide event. We've had delegates come from China, Australia, America, South America, all over Europe to what was a start-up only in 2016. So, I mean, I think that demonstrates the hunger for knowledge that isn't coming from, and we call it Groundswell because it's coming from the bottom up. It really, this is farmer-led. The industry, generally, if you're selling tractors, you're not that excited about regenerative agriculture because we tend to want to buy smaller tractors, not bigger ones, and use less diesel, less tyres, less metal, less everything. So there's that. In 21, George Eustace came, spoke, now announced the first stage of the Sustainable Farm Incentive last week, and mentioned Groundswell in his speech, but I think more than that, he mentioned a lot of what we showed him at Groundswell, which I think has actually influenced the way he's thinking about SFI, and he was talking about soil all the way through his speech. Now, 5 years ago, that simply wouldn't have been the case. It would have been about productivity or so many different things, but it feels like the British government's now got a chance to broken away from the sort of shackles of the European subsidy system. We can now go our own way, and it feels like DEFRA really do understand that the soil is the most important asset on the planet, and we need to look after it.
And I just want to say that if our listeners wonder, because I know that you are making a profit now as a farm, but does regenerative farming add anything to their food bills, the food they buy in the supermarket? People will think, well, all the fertilisers, all the tilling, at least we've had cheap food.
Golly, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think food has been too cheap, but it's also been a bit rubbish. We've all been slightly conned into producing commodity products for an industrial food system. Talk to most farmers, they grow sort of wheat, barley, oats or whatever, but it all disappears off on lorries into some system. People don't buy food items anymore. They tend to buy products, ultra-processed food in packages, and all the profit for that is being made not by farmers. We're selling stuff absolutely at the bottom of the sort of pyramid of food pricing. We're just providing the raw materials for other people to go off and turn into expensive products. And So if food prices go up, I think it won't be anything to do with the price that farmers get. It'll be the energy cost of making this, or the plastic it's wrapped in, or whatever it is. If the world's farmers don't turn to regenerative farming in 50, 60 years' time, there won't be any food for anybody to eat. It's absolutely crucial that we all look after our soil, because if we don't, then the world faces a very bleak future.
Well, let's go and take a look. I'm just treading carefully with my words here because the weather outside is cruel. It's wet and blustery, and we can't sit in here with your tin of chocolate biscuits, Paul, much longer drinking tea. We're going to have to trudge some of these fields and just look at the soil health. Am I right in saying, Paul, that wet weather is good for the soil?
The soil has been taking whatever weather it's been given for the last few million years, so it can cope with a little bit of wet weather today. We need wet, but we also need sunshine in summer. So, yeah, this is a December day. I think we're allowed to expect a bit of cold and wet. The earthworms are pretty good they can burrow down to a metre and curl up at the bottom of their hole, so we're not too worried about them, and the rest of the ecosystem just gets on with it. We're doing our best to keep the soil happy with our cover crops, and we'll hopefully see some out there.
And Paul makes a good cup of tea, Sean?
Yeah, great cup of tea, great biscuits. I want to just add to that point about wet weather being good for the soil. I would actually say it's good soils are good for wet weather. You know, if you've got good soil, then it's much more able to cope with intense rainfall events, which are only going to become more common with climate change. So I think that's what's also really important about good soils, good soil health, is them being able to cope with a changing climate. And that's both drought and floods that we are going to experience more of. So this is even more vital that this type of farming it does become more widespread.
Okay, well, let's go and have a look. Let's put our coats, hats, and most importantly, our wellies on. Thank you very much, and we'll catch up again outside.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, lovely.
Come on. Well, thank you to our panel, John and Paul Cherry and Sean from Affinity Water. We're at Weston Park Farms, but we've come out of the warmth, so perhaps, Paul, you'd like to tell us where we are?
So we're out on the farm at Weston. We're looking at a cover crop, one of the things we covered earlier, and it is yellow. It's mid-December and it's bright yellow because there's still mustard in flower. It's more than that. It's about, what are there, John, 10 species in there probably?
There's some of the species already been taken out by the early frosts, and there's other species coming through, and there's a few weeds as well, which all adds to the diversity. We're very keen on diversity here at Weston Park Farms.
Well, Sean, you must be really pleased to see these cover crops at Affinity Water, and I have to say that Affinity Water is the headline sponsor of Groundswell. Joy to your eyes to see the cover crops?
Certainly, yeah. This is a fantastic looking cover crop. You've got lots of good elements in there. You got the diversity of different species. It's taken quite well. I can see there's some brassicas in there, the mustard, oil radish. These are particularly good species for capturing nitrate. Just seeing the soil covered, we've had quite a lot of rainfall over the past 24 hours. We can walk cleanly across that field. The mud isn't sticking to our boots.
Oh, is that a test? Mud not sticking to
Yeah,
our
I mean
boots?
that's a great sign of a healthy, good soil. Yeah, walk across it if you don't end up with the big clods of mud on your boots at the end of it. Yeah, that's a good sign that it's in good order.
Paul, what's John doing?
Well, John digging. We spend a lot of time. There's no point just looking at the top of your soil. You want to dig and see what's happening within the soil. So what he's checking is to see how deep the roots are, whether the roots are going straight down or whether they're going down and then sideways, which tells us if we've got a bit of a pan in there. Roots they're like anything in nature, they always sort of follow the easy path. They'll follow an earthworm hole, or they'll follow the cavity left by last year's crops. The good thing about this is standing in places nearly a metre high, and this was sown probably after harvest, so in July, so it's had sort of 4 or 5 months of really good autumn sunshine and rain to get on and grow.
I have to just put a converse question, because we can indeed see John with his spade and digging in the soil and see where the roots are. But can this be financially viable? It's very labour intensive. If you're not using fertilisers, you're not using heavy farm machinery.
For a start, yes, we are still using fertilisers, we just use less of them. I mean, we're not organic. That's a key point. But in terms of labour intensive, no, it's less machinery, it's less diesel. Our yields may be a little bit lower, and they fluctuate, but the costs are much lower. So this is about the bottom line, and we're businessmen. We're not just here to save the planet. We need to look after ourselves as well. So we're quite clear about that. That work has been going on across the globe, America, South America, Australia, for decades now, and so that's really what it's all about.
And John, if we can just come and take a look here at your spade in the soil. Do you want to just root around in these cover crops? Yep. There's no soil sticking to my shoes, so this shows that the soil health is indeed good. And you put your spade into the soil.
Well, I'm just trying to get away from the gateway where the soil gets a little bit squashed up. But you can see it's well, there's a lovely worm for you.
It is a lovely worm, isn't it? Yeah.
But the soil's a nice dark colour, and it gets darker every year the more carbon that goes into the soil. And
can I smell it? Oh yes, you can smell it. It smells rich, doesn't it?
Groundswell, we call it. Well,
so not groundswell, groundsmell.
Groundswell. It's a lovely smell, but it's got a good structure to it.
And it's not sticking to your hands either.
It doesn't stick. It's not sticky. I mean, it doesn't kind of make a sausage. It's crucially when the water lands on the soil, it soaks in, and water's terribly important, not just for Sean and affinity water. You know, all these plants need the water to be available around the roots. So when it rains, we want it to soak in, and a lot of it to stay in the root zone, and then the rest of it can quietly filter away into groundwater. And I mean, we're standing on effectively a kind of clay soil, a clay cap which the glaciers dumped 10,000 years ago. But beneath that is chalk, and if we can get the water through the clay into the chalk, our work is done, and that'll support the chalk streams and also it's a fantastic reservoir for affinity to draw from.
And I know, Paul, you've got something to say on that about the amount of soil there is in chalk streams.
There's a good reason why rivers around the world run brown. Water isn't brown. The brown is topsoil, and that's come from somewhere. It's come from topsoil around, whether it's the Thames or the Amazon. Rivers tend to run brown, and that topsoil. Once the topsoil gets in the river, it's too late. It's gone. It'll go down to the ocean where it's not meant to be, and it's no good to anything. Sean would probably like to say something about that.
So these cover crops, Sean,
Yeah.
will help to ensure that we keep our rivers healthy.
I think so. I think there's various ways that cover crops and good soil health can help our chalk streams. Here we're at the very headwaters of the River Bean catchment on John and Paul's farm. The river isn't close by, isn't obvious to us, but their land, essentially, as John was explaining, the water will drain through the soil and will replenish the aquifer. And obviously the aquifer is what drives the chalk streams, which keeps the chalk streams flowing. So improving infiltration up in the headwaters is really important, but also further down the valley alongside the channel. If we have better soil health by the channel, by using cover crops and other techniques, we can reduce soil erosion into the chalk streams. So there's multiple benefits to the rivers by having more cover crops, better soils across the whole catchment, because most of our catchments are, apart from the bits that are with towns, actually a large portion of the catchments are farmed. So how those bits of land are farmed can have a big influence on how healthy those chalk streams will eventually be.
Okay, well, I'm just going to round off the podcast today out in this field of cover crops with the wind and the rain and our dog and our spade. What's the dog called, by the way?
It's called Bessie.
Well, she looks very active, but Groundswell this year, is it going to be different to last year in any way? Paul?
We always try and make it a bit different. It's such a huge topic that we're covering that it's quite easy to spread, but we remain true to our sort of core principles, if you like. Farmers don't like being preached to. We don't preach. This is about people making up their own minds, but they come to get ideas and to learn. Some of them are very, very conventional farmers, and indeed, it's not just farmers who come to Groundswell. The way subsidies are going, we're moving away from the old BPS system. We've got 5 years left of the old system. Even the most hard-nosed farmer it's not a difficult sum to do to see how different your balance sheet is when you haven't got that subsidy payment coming in December. So they're thinking, well, maybe we've got to farm in a different way, farm more cheaply. Oh, well, I've heard about this Groundswell thing. I'll pop to Groundswell and just see if we can pick up any hints. It's wide. It's about livestock. It's about arable. It's about food. It's about compost. It's so many things. But soil is the key asset which we're trying to look after.
Well, John, I'll just leave you with your spade there, but I think the Groundswell tickets go on sale in February.
If we're organised enough, yes, that's the plan. Yeah.
So don't miss the Groundswell event, Sean.
Definitely not. If you're interested in food and farming, it's a great local event to attend.
Okay, well, that's June 2022. Thank you very much indeed to our panel for talking to us, Paul, John and Sean. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Bonnie.